Welcome to this series of NRBS sponsored webinars. This series involves organizations that are either sponsors and or partners with NRBS. I want to put in a little plug. There's another NRBS series. It's the NRBS CE series, which is a series of 9 webinars. And for those 9, there are 9 CEs for $120, which is a bargain. To learn more about that, you can go to the NRBS website, nrbs.org, click on the programs drop down and look at NRBS CE series. All right, so today we are very happy to have folks here who have an affiliation with NAD, because NAD is a partner with NRBS. NAD, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's the National Association for Dual Diagnoses, and the dual diagnoses are developmental intellectual disabilities and mental illness. This webinar will involve Tim Barksdale, who I will introduce very soon as the moderator, talking to Beth Barole and Ginny Focht New. Ginny and Beth are trained in neurofeedback and other devices, and so they'll have a lot of relevant things to say, I'm sure. I will introduce Tim as the moderator, and then he will introduce the rest of the folks. We're very happy to have Dr. Tim Barksdale as the moderator. He's the Senior Executive Director of Clinical Services for Maricay, where he supervises a clinical team of over 50 clinicians, and their main patient population are folks with intellectual developmental disabilities and mental health issues, covering 5 states: Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, Virginia, and California. He's a doctor of clinical psychology, a licensed master social worker. He has a lot of certifications in CBT and hypnosis. He has done a lot of things. He's been an adjunct professor. He is on the NAD board of directors. He is also the current president of the Pennsylvania Psychological Association. So as you can see, Tim is a very informed, very educated, very involved gentleman. And so we're very, very happy to have Tim with us. I will tell people this before I turn it over to Tim. it is the NRBS policy of these webinars that we ask if there are questions to put them in the chat. I'll monitor the chat. If it seems like it's urgent, I will interrupt the panel. Otherwise, we will answer them at the end of their presentation. So without further ado, I turn this over to Dr. Barksdale.
Well, thank you very much, Mitch. And right now I'm president-elect. The current president is Gene Slattery of the Pennsylvania Psychological Association, but I do take on that role in June. So I will be interviewing two champions of the IDD field who bring neuroregulation to this population of people with intellectual disability and co-occurring mental illness. And this is just very important that we talk about this, because this is a population that's often forgotten, especially when it comes to providing services in the realm of behavioral health services. Seems like there's two silos, one for intellectual disability and the other for people with mental illness. And a lot of times when you're supporting someone who has an intellectual disability and you want to get them psychiatric services, you're really, I guess, affected by a term called diagnostic overshadowing. And with that, they say, well, they have an intellectual disability, so they couldn't possibly be depressed. They couldn't possibly have PTSD. They couldn't have psychosis. They just need a behavior plan. So I'm really glad that NRBS is giving us the opportunity to shed some light on this population and how neuroregulation can be used for them. So I'm going to introduce our guests, and we'll talk more about this subject. I'll start off with Dr. Virginia Folknew. She likes to be called Jenny, and she has a PhD in nursing and has been a therapist for 30 years. She is recently retired social work clinical associate professor and associate clinical director for the clinic through Widener University, where she now works as an adjunct professor. She has worked with people with intellectual and developmental differences for 50 years. She specializes in treating trauma. She's certified as a psychiatric clinical nurse specialist with additional certifications in biofeedback and neurofeedback. She has a clinical certification with NAD and the Amen clinics, and she's a certified brain health professional. She's provided numerous presentations and also has publications in a variety of journals. And in a chapter in an upcoming book published by NAD titled The Good Stuff by Dr. Uzama Price and edited by Dan Baker. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jenny. And then our second speaker, Dr. Beth Barrow. A PhD, is also licensed social worker who started out as a direct support worker and live-in house parent. That's what all three of us have in common. We were all direct support professionals. She served as a community-based project director, a residential program director, facility director, and clinician. She served as the clinical director for the Pennsylvania Office of Developmental Programs, statewide training technical assistance initiative, and that focuses on individuals with dual diagnosis. And remember, as Mitch said, when we're talking about dual diagnosis, we're talking about people with an intellectual disability and a co-occurring mental health challenge. Beth is recently retired from Widener University, where she served as an associate professor and associate dean of clinical social work. She's trained in EMDR, biofeedback, and neurofeedback, and she is a certified brain health professional through the Amen Clinic. In 2020, she was the recipient of the NAD Earl L. Lotion Award, which is given to those who can make exceptional contributions to clinical practices. Beth is currently the co-director of the Capacity Building Institute, serving Pennsylvania and the National Association of State Directors of Dual Diagnosis Services. And like Jenny, Beth and I also co-authored a chapter in the NAD published book by Dr. Usamir Price entitled The Good Stuff. My chapter was co-authored with Dr. Price on cultural aspects of biopsychosocial approach, and Jenny and Beth co-authored a chapter on neurofeedback. So maybe they'll tell us a little bit about that as we go on. But let me give you the objectives of this presentation. Participants will be able to explain what out of control, also known as challenging behavior, really means. You'll be able to plan for a variety of interventions geared to support a person to have control and to be able to modulate the challenging reactions. And participants will be able to implement holistic principles around neuroregulation to individuals with dual diagnosis and complex needs. So I'm going to start off with Beth. Can you define challenging or out of control behavior? And if you can, please explain how complex needs and trauma may fit into that definition.
Yeah, well, I'll be as brief as I can so we can get to other things. So challenging behaviors for us mean people who are aggressive to them against themselves and others. They destroy property. They don't play well with others. They run away, do everything that makes people feel threatened and unable to support them. And what we've found is that, and I started working with this 45 years ago as a live-in house parent, was that there seemed to be a lot of reasons behind this. And one of them, every time as we got to know people better, was they had terrible trauma stories. And that the more that we could understand where they were coming from, the better we could meet them where they were. And so we were looking at a variety of ways to make a difference with folks. We'll talk more about that later. And that some of them, we've been exploring to find other ways going through the body and the brain to directly help people. We think that people have made great inroads understanding that people can have dual diagnosis. When we first started out, people said they couldn't. And that people are doing some beautiful things with behavior support, but it's only one tool in the toolbox, since we want to be able to give people a wider approach.
Okay. Well, thank you. And okay, so that's a good definition. So to address those out of control behaviors or reactions, we all started out in the field using behavior modification, and then we went on to behavior analysis. And now positive behavior support appears to be that driving approach. What inspired your exploration into neurofeedback and neuro-entrainment, and how does that connect to the different approaches to out of control behavior?
So after years of using environmental supports, I really wanted to pursue the whole idea of trauma. And back in the day, again, we were told people with intellectual differences can't experience trauma. Just what they used to say, little kids didn't experience trauma. They were so-called resilient, rather than we didn't know how to see that and label that. So we were trying blindly to find ways to work with people with trauma, and we stumbled on a great guy named Andrew Siebert, who taught us EMDR. And when we were doing EMDR, I ended up doing a study with him, with people with intellectual differences, and we found that bilateral stimulation was a major piece of this. And that got me kind of excited about other ways to move the brain and to go through the body. And that got me interested in biofeedback and neurofeedback.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now,
And
I know.
then-
Oh, go ahead. I'm
I was
sorry.
just going to, if I could add, thank you. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to add to what Beth was talking about, because Beth and I have been work partners for a very long time. So much of what she just described was something that's true for me too. I wanted to just bring into that that a lot of our trauma work started back in the 80s, and that was at a time when we were just looking at people's behavior and trying to figure out what that all meant. And so at that time, I think one of the driving forces over the years has been, how could we better explain some behavioral manifestation that doesn't just focus on the behavior, but really looks at the root causes? And so being able to look at a neurological perspective, or what's going on in the brain, really helps us to better figure out what might be going wrong for that person, because we've encountered so many people with inaccurate diagnoses, what that lead to inadequate treatment, and as you mentioned, Tim, diagnostic overshadowing. And so we feel like this is a way to help us get away from, like, to step away from that behavioral analysis that we've been so stuck in for such a long time.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a lot of the professionals in our audience participate in some form of neuromodulation, whether it's EEG work, EMDR, neurofeedback, or biofeedback. But for those who are not in the field, how do you describe neurofeedback and neuro-entrainment?
Okay, so I find that I have to explain this over and over again, because as we work with people, they need to know what we're doing, right? And so I often talk about how the brain works and why it is that we might use neurofeedback. And one reason is that it helps us look at people's brainwaves, where they are, where they might be piled up, where they aren't. If we have brainwaves that are working together or working against each other, is the brain talking to itself? Is it not? And so when we use neurofeedback as an approach, or even a way to teach the brain how to best optimize what it can do, to get things out of the way that might be in the way, that won't allow a person to fully experience their thoughts and feelings and allow their brain to process what's going on. And I think that neurofeedback is one way that, once we can look at what's happening and we can see where there might be an issue, then we can direct the brain to learn better and harmonize itself, to be flexible when it needs to be flexible, to be responsive in moments when we need certain brain waves. And so it's complicated and not complicated, right? It's and so that's basically what neurofeedback is: a way to look at brain waves and a way to help brain waves learn differently to work in the brain. It's also non-invasive. So for those of you that don't know neurofeedback, there is no invasiveness, nothing's inserted, no electrical, chemical, or any other kinds of impulses.
I think that's definitely
We
helpful.
also use neuro-entrainment, which is technically a little invasive. We use things like alpha stim and Mind Alive often, because we have folks who we can't get to the playing table to do neurofeedback, and they need some other interventions to get them to the point where they're willing to or able to sit for that. But we use the least invasive options as well. We use touch points as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later.
Okay. Thank you both for that. That definitely helps. So words like biopsychosocial and integrative medicine have risen to popularity among clinicians, but what would you say are the basic principles of the whole person support approach?
We're very passionate about that, and in the chapter we wrote, we really put a lot of time into the building blocks as well. And we're saying that because from our own experience, for our own body experiences, where we're both big migraine sufferers and things like that we know the impact of pain, of what happens when you're not taking care of yourself, on your ability to be resilient in life and be able to learn and to take advantage of what happens when you have neurofeedback, for your brain to be able to quickly develop new pathways means you have to have a healthy body. And one of the things that we've noticed is that that's not really what people are focused on when we're supporting people with a dual diagnosis. That we go in and people are either onto behavior supports or psychotropic medication or both. But we don't see attention to that. And I'll give you one quick example. Going into a facility in a different state where there was a woman who was very large, obese woman, also blind, wheelchair bound, always crying out, always trying to get staff attention, and they didn't like her. And so they asked me to come in and do a review. And during the review, it turned out that she had a very painful condition in her spine. And I asked, do you think she hurts? Why she's sitting in that wheelchair all day long? And they kind of said, well, probably. I said, is she on any medicine for pain? And they said, well, she has a PRN. I said, well, how often do you give it to her? They said, we don't give it to her at all because she's always asking for it. And I'm like, oh my God. So I asked for the doctor to come in. I brought the doctor to the facility and I said, this is what I'm seeing. What do you think? Is this painful? He goes, yeah. I said, the little small dose of, like an Advil kind of thing, or Motrin, do you think that's enough for the pain? He said, no. I said, would you be willing to do an experiment of 24 hours a day for 2 weeks of an adequate dose, not PRN, administered? And he said, yes. So I came back a few weeks later. I said, how is she doing? They said, she's fine. She's great. She's not crying, whining anymore. I'm like, oh my God. So I can't tell you how we have to pay attention to that kind of stuff first and rule out all of that. Also, what are people eating? They're eating junk. There's nothing to build a healthy brain. No brain divide neurofactors in their lives. So we really have to add that in as well. So in our work, we've been called in to offer direct supporters and clinicians the full range of training. And so our chapter is called Harmonizing the Brain and Body for a Happier Life, because these are all part of that big picture. And Ginny's going to go into a little bit more detail.
Yeah, so just a few things that we should really consider. And so as Beth is talking, I realize that sometimes we don't think about how there are differences between people that have one particular diagnosis, like a cognitive neurological diagnosis, versus somebody that doesn't. And that if we can be open enough to all of this, then we just look at the person, who they are and where they are. We do need to take certain things into consideration, but the things that we're thinking about and talking about actually really apply to everybody. So Beth mentioned the brain-derived neurofactor, which is such an important part of our brain and found literally everywhere. It is all about helping the brain to learn and change and adapt to what's going on. And that might sound kind of nerdy, and I think it is, but the truth is there are some things that we do every day that can actually increase that. So BDNF helps us with sleep. And so if we're able to improve our sleep, if we're able to eat well, that we eat nutritionally dense food, not empty caloried food, if we exercise, if we meditate, if we go outside and walk in sunlight, all of those things help to increase our BDNF. They also help to calm things down. They're very good for our vagal nerve, which is the longest nerve in our body. And that goes right from our stomach to our brain. So what we put into our body really makes a difference, can help create this environment that better allows for things like neurofeedback and neuro-entrainment and EMDR and other approaches that we might use. Certainly relationships are critical. because the things that block and BDNF are stress and sugar and social isolation. We want people to have coping strategies, soothing activities, the ability to communicate. So we work with a lot of people that cannot actually articulate what they're thinking. Their body just won't work that way. However, I've worked with highly intelligent people who also can't articulate what they're really thinking and feeling. Physical well-being has a lot to do with whether or not our brain can work well. And medications, so if somebody is taking medication that's not a good match for their diagnosis, or they're overly medicated, or they're taking multiple medications, that is also a problem. And trauma. I mean, we can't emphasize enough how much this gets in the way of everything. So a person might have the best possible life and the best possible therapist, but if that trauma isn't addressed, that person's not going to get better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beth, did you want to add anything to that?
I think I'll let that go so we can. Okay. Thank you. Kim.
Okay, so let's combine a couple of concepts here. How does neurofeedback fit into a whole person support approach, and under what circumstances could this benefit people with intellectual differences and co-occurring mental illness?
So I would say that everything we've said about neurofeedback and neuro-entrainment so far is applicable to all the folks that we work with dual diagnosis. I mean, that's kind of the key point for us, that we see people who are unable to have access to their own brain. That when people have been traumatized, when they're over aroused, the thinking part gets closed off and they go into this protective overdrive mode, which can be either completely shut down or very aggressive or very self-destructive. And we can behavior mod it to a blue in the face. They're not going to be able to control themselves, because that's what it means, is being out of their own control, until we can help de-escalate what's going on in that person's brain. And that's why we're going to give some examples for you about that.
Okay. And Jenny, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's covered what we usually talk about. It certainly, we want to meet people where they are. And that is the only way we'll ever really get to be that person that we want to be as a supporter. So, and we do want to also address how we support the supporters, because for many of the people that we work with, they do have other people in their life who directly influence how their day goes. So being able to address that with supporters and caregivers too is important.
Okay.
And we're glad that people are willing to explore this with us, because we've been seeing that people get confused and think, because I don't know how to work with this person, they interpret that as this person doesn't need what we offer. And it's really, we have to draw the bridges to help people work with these wonderful human beings, and not get shied away because we don't know how to access them in the same way.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I know one of the reasons why I was excited about this approach is that a lot of times, especially for people who don't have language, who can't let you know what's going on with them, whether it's, they're angry or someone is abusing them. How does this approach, whether it's neurofeedback or neuro-entrainment, how do you see the benefits for people who don't have language, who can't access language?
I think one of the biggest benefits is that it doesn't require a lot of talking. And we can figure out ways to assess whether or not the person feels good when we use neuro-entrainment or neurofeedback, because people can identify that even if they can't explain it. And I guess I would just jump back for a second to something that Beth just said. Having been a therapist for like 30 years, for a long time, I only ever worked with people that were really therapy rejects. And they were rejects because they couldn't talk. So the therapist didn't understand what was going on for them. They didn't have insight, but that was again because the therapist couldn't tap into what might be going on in that brain, that these people are trapped inside bodies that don't work sometimes. And being able to use EMDR and now neurofeedback with folks just offers another way for people to get better without having to meet these traditional requirements of therapy. Anyway, go ahead, Beth. I know you probably have something you want to add too.
Well, just that we found that doing biographical timelines of people, particularly if they couldn't speak, helps show everybody in their life what that journey's been, and they became more empathetic and willing to try a variety of approaches because they could actually almost live with them through what they've experienced, and were less judgmental and more compassionate, and that evoked more from the caregivers. So, but what we have seen, even with this, is that we have to do a major training of direct supporters of all types, because sometimes we will even offer to lend alpha stims, for example, to someone who's in and out of psych hospitals and crashing and burning, and we know it will be helpful, but they won't use it because they've never heard of it. They'd rather see them on mega doses of Haldol than try something like an alpha stim. So we really have to get into the people's daily practice to understand things so we have access.
Okay. Beth, your voice is dipping a little bit, but you used the term biographical timelines. So could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, and how about, is it better if I turn up my volume this way? Maybe? You're louder. Okay.
Yeah, speak louder.
Okay.
There you go.
All right. Thank you for letting me know. What we do is we get people in people's lives together, and we walk through a person's history with as much details we can find from the record, from pre-birth to now, and together analyze what happened to that person in terms of their brain, their body, connection to others, their sense of self. And in every case, people can suddenly understand that there has been trauma, including head injury trauma, brain trauma that way. And it's surprising how many times. I just recently worked with someone who was literally throwing his body through the wall. Like they had body-shaped holes in the wall. And I asked him, had he ever had a head trauma? And they said, no. Just the fact that he's throwing himself through the wall, that's going to be bouncing up. But I said, let's pursue this. And when we look more into the biography, we found he'd fallen out of a window, a second-story window. He'd fallen out of a tree. He'd been hit by a car, bounced off in the back of his head. He'd been knocked unconscious by someone stealing his Walkman. And they said, but he's never had a head injury. It's like, oh my God. And so they never thought to do any work that would help with head injury. So, it's important to get these big pictures.
No, it definitely helps. So you mentioned trauma, and there's physical trauma, like you said, the head injury. And then when we think about trauma, we think about historical things. But what about the day-to-day experiences of people? How does that play into the whole concept of trauma?
I think sometimes when people have experienced a lot of trauma, first of all, we minimize the impact at any point in somebody's life. So
Mhm.
something can happen early on, and then we say, oh, that was a long time ago. They must have gotten over it. And we need to just resist that, because that's so not true. In fact, that probably at that point in time, things changed in a person's brain. We know that trauma changes the brain, and we know that it changes brain waves. And so the brain can get stuck in a certain pattern. And then this is how it copes, and this is how it lives. And that becomes the lens of somebody's life. So they no longer remember that what they're doing today had something to do with something that happened in the past. So their everyday life is informed by their past. And if we can't figure out, as Beth is describing, using something like a biographical timeline, if we can't figure out what actually happened to that person, it's really hard to direct our supports.
Okay.
However, we've gotten to a point where we just can ourselves assume something's going on and
Yep.
go directly to assess the brain and how everything's going. And neurofeedback folks can certainly do that, and doing the mini maps and things like that, which is really important, because we're not going to be able to get that kind of information for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I think that's where trauma-informed care comes, that we just kind of assume that everyone's had some type of trauma. And so we're constantly in that approach of making sure that they have a safe environment as they move through life. Well, thank you. And now let's get to the good stuff here.
Yeah.
Tell us about some of these successes that you've had with neurofeedback and neuro-entrainment.
So I have 2 stories to tell, and then Beth has a couple too. So I just want to start with an assessment with a young woman, we'll call her Patty, who has a long history of trauma, and as a result, pretty intense anxiety, and also has cerebral palsy. So in the beginning, this person was really uncomfortable with what we might be doing. So I find that no matter who it is, I spend a lot of time explaining and showing, let me show you brainwaves, let me show you the sensors, let me show you what this does. And so we put sensors on her hand, and we put sensors on somebody else, and that kind of thing. When we actually got to the assessment part, we had to practice sitting still, which is really hard for somebody that has muscle spasms. And so we would practice just 15 seconds and then 30 seconds, and then, but trying to relax at the same time. Now, this person has spent a long time in therapy with somebody who's really good at all of those sort of body relaxation kinds of approaches. And so we are still in the process. So each time we meet, we might assess one location. So, in the front, in the middle. And so each time we take our time, and then this Patty will say, I'm done. And then we're done, because Patty needs to be in control of everything that we do, not me. And so I just want to say that I think we should be thoughtful about that in any assessment, that we want to take our time. The second person that I'll talk about, we'll call her Kelly. Kelly is 10 years old. Kelly was 9 weeks premature when she was born. And she has, when she copes, she can cope really well. But if she becomes hungry or tired, or somebody asks her to make a switch to something else without giving her time to prepare for that, she just falls apart, and she will yell and scream and hit and do some of those things that Beth described as challenging behavior. So when we first started looking at her brainwaves, it turned out that she's got a lot of slow waves in the front, which is a problem. So for those of you that don't know about much about brainwaves, we want a lot of fast waves in the front, because this is where we think. We want more slow waves in the back, because that's where we sleep. And we want our fast waves to be calmed down when we're sleeping. We don't want to be working on projects in our sleep, and we don't want to be sleeping when we're doing projects. And in between, we need to have a little bit of space where we're sort of ready and focused, which doesn't happen for a lot of people that have had trauma. Their brain is fired up all the time, or people that have had head injuries where those slow waves are always in process, right? So Kelly had lots of slow waves in the front, and she had lots of fast waves too. So her brain was doing the best it could to balance both of them. Fired up the brain waves to balance out those slow waves and try to find. And so when something would happen, she couldn't shift with it. She had no flexibility. In addition to that, she had, and this was more of a maturational issue, not an ADD kind of problem or a head injury problem. She would wet the bed at night. So she's 10 and getting closer and closer to staying overnight with friends or, doing things like that, and which would be rather embarrassing having to wear a pull-up, right? She probably was sleeping really deeply because of those slow waves and wouldn't wake up if her bladder said, oh, it's time to go to the bathroom. That wouldn't happen for her. So we started training. And she had, for those that do have neurofeedback experience, her amplitudes at CZ were up in almost to 40. Like she has a ton of flow waves in the front. With training, we've gotten that down into the 20s. And we use touch points, which are these, I don't have my touch points here. I think Beth has them. Maybe you could show them to us. There's something that you could wear on your hands or on your wrist. They alternate buzzing, they vibrate and they alternate. And so we put them on her ankles. And when we use neurofeedback in a session and she has the touch points on, actually her amplitudes come down. Now we have to do other things at the same time, work with her parents to know how to support her when she has problems, help her. She now keeps a chart for herself. If she's really close to yelling and screaming and she doesn't do it, she can hold herself back, go do something else. She gives herself a star. First she had no stars. She's up to 4 stars now. The thing is, now she's getting to know how she feels and she's learning that she could manage some of that. And the beauty of neurofeedback is that we don't just have to depend on the neurofeedback. We can also develop breathing techniques and meditation and walking and all of those things I mentioned earlier that can really help all of these things come together and help a person live a healthier life. And she's doing much, much better thanks to neurofeedback.
Thanks. Those are great examples of just how someone can get emotion regulation. Beth, what are your stories?
I'm going to give 2 stories. One is a longitudinal case study. A man I'll call Michael, who I met when he was 12 and I was a beginning direct care worker. And he had, I later did his biographical timeline, 9 foster homes before he was 4 and then institutionalized. He was a young man with mild cerebral palsy and diagnosis of intellectual disability and very wild behavior. He's a little kid, eat stuff he shouldn't eat, take apart the electrical sockets, do all kinds of stuff. Sweet though, always sweet. And I knew him, then I started my own group home, and then I kept dipping into his life, and he's been my muse. And at one point, they wanted to put him on antipsychotics, and his adopted parents at that point, who were friends of mine, asked me if I'd treat him with EMDR, because they knew I'd be EMDR. And this is about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And so I did, and I won't go into detail, but he really did well with some of the trauma processing. And we would go for a walk afterwards, And he started asking me questions he'd been wondering about since he was a little kid. Why couldn't Thomas speak? He never asked those questions before, but his organization started changing, his ability to make those connections. He was not very articulate. He had a struggle to hear. As the years went by, he had a few more losses. He became very self-abusive again, cutting, throwing dresser doors out the window. And we were thinking about having me do EMDR, but instead I thought maybe we could use neuro-entrainment. So we started with Mind Alive, which is goggles that have a light show in your eyes and headphones that go ear to ear and bum, 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 bum. And you can set the frequencies. Big changes right away. All that destructiveness stopped, the self-abuse stopped. Now his life also was improving because we were dipping in to figure out what we could do more about that. He rode an exercise bike an hour a day, and he's been using that every day for a couple of years. And I asked him, you know, do you see anything different? He says, I feel better in my mind and in my body. And he used to talk about how I have thoughts, but they're like this and I can't get them out. And now he's able to get them out more. So then he was doing well and continues to do well. And we also added then neurofeedback. And he had a situation where anytime there's any calmness moment, he drops off to sleep. He could sleep at the table, the car, no matter what. And so he wanted to try the neurofeedback. So we just did the easy, and he was for the first 10 minutes, you're up and off to sleep like that. And I'm like, try to keep your eyes open. Try to look. I'm like nagging for it. You want to do this? Yeah. Okay, well, let's try to look. And after 10 minutes, all of a sudden, he was like riveted to the screen, shiny eyes, connect in a way I hadn't seen him connect before. And I said, how do you like it? He says, I love it. And the whole evening, he was alert, even the car ride home, alert and talking. So whenever he says he likes that a lot, and you can see a difference. And I want to tell you now, fast forward to recently, this is a man who never could tell me how old he was. So he's now 58. And I used to say to him, how old are you? And he'd say, maybe 11. Okay, now he'll say, I'm 58 and I'll be 59 in May. He never knew what time it was. Last time he was over, I said, what time do we have to leave? He said, well, we have to leave at 2:30, which gives us 15 minutes. I said, who are you? And what did you do with Michael? You know, this is like amazing. And the way he organizes his thought, and he'll say, like, my point is, you know, when he's trying to say something, I mean, it's amazing. And now he holds himself. I'm saying this because when I started in the field, they said, by the time they're 6 years old, there's not going to be much improvement. And we know that's junk, right? We also know that all we know about brain injury, head trauma, stroke, all this kind of stuff hasn't crossed over into the IDD world. We haven't generated that knowledge about brain and brain development. And that's what we want to help people make that connection. I want to do a quick last one because I know people might have some questions. Did a 3-day, what we call trauma healing immersion, where we have folks who have serious trauma stories, but who can sustain group time. You know, they're not completely set off by being in a group. And we walk them through, this is what trauma does to you, your brain and your body. We cook healthy food and eat healthy food together. We do different neuro-entrainment. The women came in, there were a total of 12 women in the group. 6 of them had intellectual differences and very serious trauma stories. And they came in, they were like this at the beginning. They were set off very easily. They're very agitated. And we asked if you'd like to try using touch points. Would you like to try Mind Alive? Would you like Alpha Sim? And they were willing. I put them on and modeled it, and they did. And the difference in their faces and talking about, I feel good. I feel relaxed. They toned down. That after just 3 days, they were able to listen to each other say something, and someone would get up and go, I'm so sorry, I love you, and put their arm around someone and calm them down. Their peers, their friends, they were able to do this. And we just did them a couple times a day. They tried the different kinds of devices. Now, in addition to eating well, in addition to going for walks and doing yoga and breathing together, but 3 days, tight, scared to having pink cheeks, shiny eyes, looking at each other, talking freely, being able to talk things that weren't trauma, which was a big point, that they were able to be freed up enough to relate, I thought was pretty significant. So
I love that. It sounds like it's really tapping into our executive functioning, a lot of these stories. We have some questions from the audience. One of the main questions is, how do you find someone who specializes in neurofeedback that can address people with intellectual disabilities in their communities? I mean, are there other professionals who are doing this?
yes, and
Tell me more.
Yeah. I wish I had a lot more, but I think which could be even more helpful about ways we can look people up. I know that looking up on NRBS and looking at who registers and what their people are interested in. We've been trying to get more and more people interested. Hopefully, if we look around this room, people will say, "Hey, I'm game," and want to. I mean, I would love us to have a peer supervision for folks who want to practice with a different group of people than they've done before. And I think that could really start to expand the horizons. I know Mitch and Angelica have been doing a lot to help train people. And that the numbers are growing.
Okay. Yeah, so Mitch, does NRBS have a directory where you can look folks up?
Well, we are actually putting it together a directory. There is a directory with BCIA, which is the board certification, biofeedback certification international alliance, BCIA.org, that you can look and see where the people are that are certified in neurofeedback and or biofeedback. And so that, that's a place as well. But let me put in a little.
Well, it looks like Saul threw in the chat the link for finding that out for bcia.org. So thanks.
Very
Saul.
good, Saul. Yes. Now, I do hope the people listening to this see that, first of all, realize there is a need. This is a population that has been ignored, but there's also such value and such potential here. So the people, if you can look around and see if locally there's an organization or a group home or whatever, and I think Beth's offer or idea for peer supervision, and I think this would be a thing that NRBS would be willing to kind of coordinate, because there is such a huge need here. So Just a thought.
Yeah.
All right.
We've only touched the surface of some of the things that we've been seeing that the neurofeedback can be helpful with for folks. Because the more we understand about brains, the more we understand that some things that people have called psychosis haven't been psychosis. And
Yep.
there's so many ways that we've seen people medicated into being zombies when we can turn it around. Even Michael I talked about was on heavy medication and he got off it. And that's also helping him lighten up.
Yeah, I think any alternative to being over medicated is generally welcome. So this has been a delightful discussion. I see that we're down to our end. This is to 1 o'clock, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity. I'd like to thank NAD and I'd like to thank NRBS for this opportunity.
And thank you to you, Tim, and to Ginny and to Beth. I think this has been very informative. I know there are a couple of questions that were in the chat that there hasn't been time to answer. I will hang around a couple minutes here to try to answer them. And so, but for those of you on the clock, thanks a lot for being here. Hope to see you again in the future. And thanks to everybody.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thanks, Jenny and Beth.
Bye.
So there was a question about are you guys aware of any success with borderline personality disorder with meth addiction? And I think, first of all, Gary Ames answered later that neurofeedback tends to be agnostic as far as a diagnosis goes. We aren't about, diagnosis, we're about function. And I'll just say, yeah, there's been a lot of work with personality disorders in general. That's a diagnostic category that for so many years said you can't really treat this with psychotherapy, you can't do this. And C. Bern Fisher in particular has said that's a bunch of baloney. Neurofeedback is so helpful, and certainly in the addictions field, neurofeedback is being used more and more. One of the original research, the very good research in this field was in the 80s by a gentleman, Peniston and Kolkolsky, and it was one of the first protocols used with both addiction and one can argue trauma. So I answered that as best I could. That
Yeah, I saw that as a question, and we see that all the time in terms of, the traditional definition of dual diagnosis was someone who had, substance abuse and co-occurring mental illness. So the whole concept of intellectual disability and co-occurring mental illness is more recent.
very good. And then someone asked about the applicability of general biofeedback with a person who has a medication managed seizure disorder and ADHD, but they're also very anxious. And what would your thoughts be about using biofeedback with such a person?
So I liked what Guy Bauman responded about biofeedback being something that's from bottom up, and that neurofeedback is something that's top down. And there's a lot of research behind neurofeedback and seizures, certainly with the ADHD. And biofeedback, I kind of think that, deep relaxation and HRV is something that pretty much everybody could benefit from, even if you don't have a particular issue with seizures or ADD. So sometimes that's, as Beth has talked about, the neuro-entrainment devices or neuromodulation devices. Sometimes these are ways to introduce people to ways that can help their brain work better. And then we can maybe move to neurofeedback to kind of speed it up a little bit.
If someone has a seizure disorder, I'd be very careful with the neurofeedback to work with someone who's trained to work with people with seizure disorders.
Yes, absolutely.
And the same with certain other neuro-entrainment. We don't want to accidentally evoke seizures. So just want to be working
Very
closely
good.
with practitioners.
And then the last question that I'm aware of was someone asked if the VA has anything like this available to veterans.
I know the VA has bought lots of neuro-entrainment devices and have been using it quite a bit. Gary, I saw you shake your head at one point, and I was wondering if you wanted to jump in on something.
Well, yeah, I just want to go back to that. Neurofeedback's pretty agnostic with regard to diagnosis, and that seizures. I mean, we have Gabriel Tan on this call. He's done huge amounts of research, more research for neurofeedback than any other. I mean, yeah, you've got to get your protocols right, of course, but that's true for anybody. I don't see them as such a special case.
Great, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think with the VA, you need to check with your local VA. There are certainly some VAs around the country that offer biofeedbacks. Some offer neurofeedback, but it isn't by any means ubiquitous. So I would say check with your local VA, and as Saul wrote in the chat, there are many neurofeedback, biofeedback providers who are willing to offer services to veterans at a reduced or a pro bono rate, because we're thankful for their service.
I tell you, I just discovered yesterday that Nevada's Medicaid has approved neurotherapy for 10 different disorders.
Oh, that's good news.
All right, I think that's everything that I was aware of in the chat. I appreciate Ginny and Beth hanging around to answer. I'm going to leave, and I think maybe this will be the end. So I appreciate, everybody. Thanks a lot, and see you again next time.